Part 2, page 92. But where some saw abstraction, others saw the truth. But the first month of the plague ended gloomily with a violent recrudescence of the epidemic and a dramatic sermon preached by Father Panelou, the Jesuit priest who had given an arm to old Michel when he was tottering home at the start of his illness. Father Panelou had already made his mark with frequent contributions to the Oran Geographical Society. These dealt chiefly with ancient inscriptions on which he was an authority. But he had also reached a wider, non-specialist public with a series of lectures on present-day individualism. In these, he had shown himself a stalwart champion of Christian doctrine at its most precise and purest, equally remote from modern laxity and the obscurantism of the past. On these occasions, he had not shrunk from trouncing his hearers with some vigorous home truth. Hence, his local celebrity. Toward the end of the month, the ecclesiastical authorities in our town resolved to do battle against the plague with the weapons appropriate to them and organized a week of prayer. These manifestations of public piety were to be concluded on Sunday by a high mass celebrated under the auspices of Saint Roch, the plague-stricken saint, and Father Panelou was asked to preach the sermon. For a fortnight, he desisted from the research work on St. Augustine and the African Church that had won for him a high place in his order. A man of a passionate, fiery temperament, he flung himself wholeheartedly into the task assigned him. The sermon was a topic of conversation long before it was delivered, and in its way, it marks an important date in the history of the period. There were large attendances at the services of the week of prayer. It must not, however, be assumed that in normal times the townsfolk of Oran are particularly devout. On Sunday mornings, for instance, sea bathing competes seriously with church-going. Nor must it be thought that they had seen a great light and had a sudden change of heart. But for one thing, now that the town was closed and the harbor out of bounds, there was no question of bathing. Moreover, they were in quite exceptional frame of mind, and though in their heart of hearts they were far from recognizing the enormity of what had come on them, they couldn't help feeling, for obvious reasons, that decidedly something had changed. Nevertheless, many continued hoping that the epidemic would soon die out and they and their families be spared. Thus, they felt under no obligation to make any change in their habits as yet. Plague was for them an unwelcome visitant, bound to take its leave one day as unexpectedly as it had come. Alarmed but far from desperate, they hadn't yet reached the phase when plague would seem to them the very tissue of their existence, when they forgot the lives until now it had been given them to lead. In short, they were waiting for the turn of events. With regard to religion, as to many other problems, plague had induced in them a curious frame of mind, as remote from indifference as from fervor. The best name to give it perhaps might be objectivity. Most of those who took part in the week of prayer would have echoed a remark made by one of the churchgoers in Dr. Rieu's hearing, quote, "Anyhow, it can't do any harm," end quote. Even Tarou, after recording in his notebook that in such cases the Chinese fault playing tambourines before the genius of the plague, observed that there was no means of telling whether, in practice, tambourines proved more efficacious than prophylactic measures. He merely added that, to decide the point, we should need first to ascertain if a genius of plague actually existed, and our ignorance on this point nullified any opinions we might form. In any case, the cathedral was practically always full of worshipers throughout the week of prayer. For the first 2 or 3 days, many stayed outside, under the palms and pomegranate trees in the garden in front of the porch, and listened from a distance to the swelling tide of prayers and invocations whose backwash filled the neighboring streets. But once an example had been given, they began to enter the cathedral and join timidly in the responses. And on the Sunday of the sermon, a huge congregation filled the nave, overflowing onto the steps and precincts. The sky clouded up on the previous day, and now it was raining heavily. Those in the open unfurled umbrellas. The air outside the cathedral was heavy with fumes of incense and the smell of wet clothes when Father Panelou stepped into the pulpit. He was a stockily built man of medium height when he leaned on the edge of the pulpit, grasping the woodwork with his big hands. All one saw was a black, massive torso, and above it, two rosy cheeks overhung by steel-rimmed spectacles. He had a powerful, rather emotional delivery, which carried to a great distance. And when he launched the congregation, his opening phrase in clear, emphatic tones, "Calamity has come on you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it." There was a flutter that extended to the crowd massed in the rain outside the porch. In strict logic, what came next did not seem to follow from this dramatic opening. Only as the sermon proceeded did it become apparent to the congregation that, by a skilled oratorical device, Father Panelou had launched at them, like a fisticuff, the gist of his whole discourse. After launching it, he went on at once to quote a text from Exodus relating to the plague of Egypt and said, "The first time this scourge appears in history, it was yielded to strike down the enemies of God. Pharaoh set himself against the divine will, and the plague beat him to his knees. Thus, from the dawn of recorded history, the scourge of God has humbled the proud of heart and laid low those who harden themselves against him. Ponder this well, my friends, and fall on your knees."